The grand hall of the Department of Justice buzzed with reporters eager for their next soundbite. The room was packed with journalists from all major networks, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every word. At the podium stood Pam Bondi, the United States Attorney General, known for her sharp legal mind, unwavering commitment to justice, and fierce loyalty to President Donald J. Trump. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and today was no different. Seated in the front row was Claire Remington, a well-known reporter from Liberty Press, a left-leaning news network notorious for its aggressive questioning of the Trump administration. Claire had built her career on challenging conservative figures, often lacing her questions with thinly veiled contempt. Today, she was armed with what she believed was her most cutting remark yet. As Pam Bondi adjusted the microphone, Claire smirked and raised her hand, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her notepad. "Yes, Ms. Remington," Bondi said, her voice crisp and controlled. Claire leaned forward, her tone dripping with condescension. "Madam Attorney General, many Americans believe that you are nothing more than a Trump lapdog, blindly defending the president regardless of the ethical or legal implications. Would you care to respond?" A stunned silence fell over the room. A few gasps could be heard from the back while some reporters exchanged knowing glances. They had seen Claire's tactics before: push the button, provoke the reaction, and get the viral moment. But Pam Bondi was no amateur. She arched an eyebrow, taking a calculated pause to let the insult linger in the air before dismantling it piece by piece. Slowly, she folded her hands on the podium and met Claire's gaze with unwavering confidence. "Let me make something absolutely clear, Ms. Remington," Bondi began, her voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I have dedicated decades of my life to the pursuit of justice, not political theater. If defending the rule of law and ensuring that justice is served makes me a lapdog, then I wonder what that makes you, a watchdog for misinformation?" The room stirred. Some reporters scribbled furiously while others exchanged hushed whispers. Claire's smirk faltered for a brief second, but she quickly regained her composure. Bondi continued, her tone growing sharper. "You see, I find it ironic that you accuse me of blind loyalty while sitting there with pre-written narratives waiting for a chance to insert an insult rather than ask a substantive question. If you were truly here to engage in meaningful journalism, you'd ask about the policies, the legal framework, or the facts, not resort to schoolyard name-calling." Claire shifted in her seat, sensing the growing energy in the room. But she wasn't ready to back down just yet. "Then tell me, Attorney General," Claire shot back. "Is it just a coincidence that every major investigation under your leadership seems to benefit the president politically?" Bondi let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. "It's interesting how quickly you dismiss facts when they don't fit your narrative, Claire. The DOJ operates independently and every case we handle is based on evidence, not partisan whims. But since you seem to struggle with that concept, perhaps I should explain it to you in simpler terms." Bondi leaned forward slightly, her expression unwavering. "If a suspect is caught on camera robbing a bank and the prosecution pursues the case, would you accuse them of being a lapdog for the bank? Or would you accept the reality that a crime was committed and justice must be served?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Bondi wasn't finished. "You see, the real issue here isn't my supposed bias, it's yours. Because if I were pursuing a case that harmed conservatives, you wouldn't be calling me a lapdog. You'd be singing my praises on national television." The tension in the room was palpable. Even some of Claire's fellow reporters looked intrigued, watching how this verbal duel would unfold. But this was just the beginning. Pam Bondi had more to say, and Claire Remington was about to learn a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Claire Remington swallowed hard, adjusting her posture as she tried to regain her footing. She had come prepared to attack, but Pam Bondi wasn't just defending, she was counterattacking. The tension in the room grew heavier with each passing second as reporters sat transfixed, watching the exchange unfold. Bondi took a slow, deliberate breath, making sure the silence stretched just long enough to put Claire further on edge. Then, with a smirk, she continued. "You know, Claire, I remember when journalism was about facts, not clickbait insults. When reporters were interested in truth, not just crafting a viral moment that plays well on Twitter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The remark hit its mark. Claire rolled her eyes, trying to dismiss the comment. "With all due respect, Attorney General, this isn't about clickbait. This is about accountability." "Accountability?" Bondi let out a soft chuckle. "That's rich, coming from someone who just called me a Trump lapdog instead of asking a legitimate question. But fine, let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about the double standards in media." Claire crossed her arms, ready for the next verbal jab. Bondi's expression hardened. Where was the same level of aggressive questioning when the last administration weaponized government agencies against its political opponents? Where was your so-called accountability when the FBI targeted parents at school board meetings as domestic threats? Or when the IRS went after conservative organizations for simply existing? Claire stiffened. Those cases were investigated and there was no widespread. Bondi cut her off. Spare me the excuses. Those cases were downplayed, buried, or outright ignored by networks like yours because they didn't fit your agenda. And yet here you sit pretending to be the grand arbiter of accountability while twisting facts to fit a narrative. Claire's face flushed red, but she wasn't done fighting. So you're saying the media should just stop asking tough questions? Bondi shook her head. No, I'm saying the media should start asking real questions. You call this holding power accountable, but all you're doing is pushing propaganda under the disguise of journalism. If you actually cared about the truth, you'd be asking about policy decisions, legal precedents, and case facts, not throwing out petty insults like some political activist on a microphone. The room was electric. Even some of Claire's colleagues, many of whom leaned liberal themselves, were taking mental notes. Bondi was teaching a masterclass in dismantling bias, and they knew it. A senior journalist from another network, clearly intrigued, took the opportunity to interject. Madam Attorney General, what would you say is the biggest misconception that the media continues to push about your role? Bondi turned her attention toward him, her tone softening slightly. The biggest misconception? That we're making legal decisions based on politics rather than evidence and law. That's not how the Justice Department operates, at least not under my watch. We prosecute based on facts, not feelings. She turned back to Claire, her gaze unwavering. And if that makes me a lapdog, then maybe you should ask yourself who's the real puppet here? The prosecutor following the law or the journalist following a narrative? Claire opened her mouth but had nothing to say. For the first time in her career, she had been schooled on live television and the entire country was watching. A tense silence hung in the air, thick and unyielding. The room, once filled with murmurs and shuffling papers, had gone eerily still. Reporters exchanged uncertain glances, their pens frozen over notepads as if afraid to miss the next verbal strike. Claire Remington shifted in her seat, her face burning under the spotlight of scrutiny. She wasn't used to being on the defensive, especially not in her own arena. She had built a career on pushing conservatives into corners, forcing them to stammer and stumble under pressure. But today, it was Pam Bondi who had turned the tables, and Claire could feel the weight of every eye in the room waiting for her next move. Still, she wasn't about to roll over. You claim the Department of Justice operates without political bias, Claire said, her voice a bit sharper now, an attempt to reassert control. But how do you explain the disproportionate focus on cases that just happen to benefit the president? Bondi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Claire, let's stop pretending you actually care about fairness. If this administration were ignoring crimes committed by its allies, you'd be the first one screaming about obstruction of justice. But when we follow the law and it just so happens to implicate people on your side, suddenly we're biased. A few reporters chuckled under their breath. Bondi had a point and everyone knew it. Bondi continued, her voice steady. You want disproportionate focus? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how your network, and most of the mainstream media, spent years obsessing over false narratives, from collusion hoaxes to whistleblower fabrications, all in an attempt to discredit this administration. And yet, when there's actual corruption, documented evidence, and real crimes, you barely give it a headline. Claire's jaw clenched. That's not true. Oh, it absolutely is, Bondi shot back. When a conservative figure is accused of wrongdoing, it's breaking news for weeks. When a liberal politician or bureaucrat gets caught in corruption, it's a 5-second segment buried under a fluff piece about panda conservation. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Claire's face twisted in frustration, but she wasn't ready to surrender. You're deflecting, she snapped. The fact remains that this administration has shown unprecedented levels of protectionism for its allies. Bondi tilted her head, giving her a look of bemusement. Unprecedented? That's interesting. Tell me, Claire, were you this concerned about protectionism when the last administration's DOJ dropped charges against politically connected individuals? When they misused FISA warrants to spy on journalists and citizens? Or does unprecedented only apply when it's convenient for your narrative? Claire faltered. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The room buzzed with energy. Reporters were no longer just covering the press conference. They were witnessing a reckoning, one that would be played, replayed, and dissected across media platforms for days to come. Bondi sighed and took a sip of water before continuing. Look, I understand why you asked the question. I really do. You're trying to frame a story because that's what you've been trained to do. But the problem is the American people are catching on. They see the double standards, the selective outrage, the manufactured scandals, and they're sick of it. She leaned in slightly, as if delivering a final blow. So if I were you, Claire, I'd worry less about whether I'm a lapdog and more about whether the American people see you as one. The air crackled with intensity. Claire swallowed, gripping her notepad tightly. For the first time in her career, she had been completely outmaneuvered in front of a national audience. And Pam Bondi wasn't even finished. Claire Remington felt her pulse quicken. She had walked into this press conference expecting to control the narrative, to trap Pam Bondi in a soundbite that would go viral across social media and late-night television. Instead, she found herself in Bondi's arena fighting to salvage her own credibility. The other reporters sensed it too. Some of them, usually quick to pounce on any Republican official, were now hesitating, not because they disagreed with Claire's line of questioning, but because they saw the shift happening in real time. Bondi wasn't just answering questions, she was dismantling them, exposing the media's selective outrage in a way that even some of her critics had to acknowledge. Claire straightened her shoulders, refusing to let Bondi have the last word. She forced a smirk. So, you think the media is out to get you? That's a convenient excuse, isn't it? Play the victim, avoid the real issues. Bondi laughed. It wasn't forced or defensive, it was genuine, the kind of laugh that told everyone in the room that she was completely unfazed. Claire, Bondi said, shaking her head, I don't play the victim. That's your network's specialty. Every time this administration enforces the law, you cry oppression. Every time a journalist gets criticized, you play the martyr. Every time a conservative fights back, you call it dangerous rhetoric. But when your side does it, it's called speaking truth to power. Claire's smirk faltered. Bondi continued, her voice growing sharper. Let's be real. The only reason you're upset right now is because I'm not playing along. You're used to conservatives backpedaling, apologizing, trying to appease the outrage mob. But I don't answer to you. I answer to the law. She folded her arms. And by the way, if you actually cared about real issues, you'd be asking about our efforts to fight crime, defend constitutional rights, and hold corrupt officials accountable. But you didn't come here for that. You came here with a pre-written attack, hoping I'd fumble so you could run another Republican in crisis headline. The room was dead silent. Even the most liberal reporters in attendance were struggling to find an opening to push back. Bondi had stripped Claire's argument down to its bones, and there was nothing left to salvage. Claire felt the heat creeping up her neck. She had to say something, anything, to regain control. All right, she snapped, if you're so focused on facts, let's talk about a real one. The DOJ under your leadership has refused to pursue cases that would be politically inconvenient for the administration. How do you justify that? Bondi arched an eyebrow. Which cases are you referring to? Claire hesitated. Bondi smirked. You don't have an example, do you? You just threw that out there hoping I'd have to defend something vague enough to be manipulated later. The reporters watching the exchange knew Bondi was right. Claire had overplayed her hand, banking on the assumption that Bondi would stammer or stumble. Instead, the Attorney General had flipped the script, turning the entire conversation into a referendum on media bias. Bondi leaned in slightly, her expression calm but firm. I get it, Claire. Your job isn't to report the news, it's to shape it. You're not interested in truth, you're interested in narratives. And when those narratives get exposed, you lash out, hoping no one notices the double standard. She gestured toward the cameras. But they do notice, Claire. The American people notice. And that's why trust in the media is at an all-time low. A few reporters, clearly uncomfortable, shuffled in their seats. Claire swallowed hard. She had been in dozens of confrontations with conservative officials before. She had even baited a few into giving her the viral soundbites she wanted. But this time was different. Pam Bondi wasn't playing defense. She was playing to win. And Claire had just lost. Claire Remington sat frozen, gripping her notepad so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her usual confidence, her ability to dominate an interview, to control the tone of a conversation, had been shattered. Pam Bondi had not only countered her attacks but had exposed the deeper flaw in her approach, the media's obsession with narratives over truth. The reporters in the room sensed it. Some were still scribbling notes, while others had abandoned their usual routines, too engrossed in the exchange to look away. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Claire's unraveling. Pam Bondi took a breath, scanning the room with the cool confidence of someone who knew she had one. "Let me tell you something, Claire," Bondi said, her voice unwavering. "I don't mind tough questions. I don't mind scrutiny. But what I won't tolerate is dishonesty disguised as journalism." Claire forced a tight-lipped smile, still desperate to claw back some ground. "You keep saying dishonesty, but the media's job is to challenge those in power." Bondi held up a hand, cutting her off. "Then do it. Challenge everyone in power. Not just the people you don't like. Not just the conservatives. Not just this administration. If you were truly about accountability, you'd be questioning both sides with the same level of intensity. But you don't. And that's why people don't trust you anymore." The room was silent. Claire tried again. "You're painting the press as the enemy." Bondi's eyes narrowed. "No, Claire. I'm painting corrupt, biased media as the enemy of truth. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it's time for some self-reflection." A low murmur spread through the room. Some reporters glanced at each other, unsure how to proceed. This wasn't a usual press conference anymore. This was a turning point. Bondi leaned in slightly, her final words sharp as a dagger. "You came in here today hoping to make me look weak. Instead, you showed the entire country just how weak your own arguments are. And that's why this moment will live on, not as the day you exposed me, but as the day you got exposed." Claire's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Bondi turned away from the podium, signaling to her press secretary that she was done. The cameras followed her as she strode confidently out of the room, leaving Claire and the rest of the press stunned. As the doors shut behind her, a few reporters sat in stunned silence, others whispered among themselves. But across America, millions of viewers had just witnessed something they rarely saw, a conservative standing her ground and turning the tables on a biased media narrative. And in that moment, one thing was crystal clear. Pam Bondi had just schooled the press, and there was nothing they could do to change it.